My life completely changed that September morning. I was in my San Francisco office when I got the news that my grandpa had passed away. Amid all the meetings and spreadsheets in my tech job, that phone call from Sheriff Wilson took me right back to Pine Valley, the place where I spent the best summers of my childhood. The inheritance of the country house wasn't a surprise. My grandpa always made it clear that that place was my legacy. What I didn't know was that along with those stone walls and century-old vineyards, I'd also inherit a battle that would change not just my fate, but that of an entire community. I remember exactly the moment I stepped onto the porch and saw the valley stretching out to the horizon. That's when I realized I was going to have to fight with all I had to preserve this piece of my family's history. Subscribe to the channel and hit like to get access to more stories like this. The first sign that something was wrong came through a letter. It wasn't some simple notice about a late mail delivery or an overdue bill. It was an official notification from Golden Heights Estates, informing me that my property was within the area designated for their new real estate development. The next morning, I drove into downtown Pine Valley to meet up with Sarah, my cousin. As a lawyer specialized in real estate law, she always had a knack for sensing shady business. One glance at the documents was enough to completely change her expression. The zoning records had inconsistencies that just didn't add up. We decided to dig deeper and headed over to the city registry office. Robert Parker, an employee who had known my family for decades, greeted us with a worried look. In a low voice, he told us about recent visits from men in expensive suits, always accompanied by Brian Mitchell, the head architect from Golden Heights. I went back home that day with more questions than answers. From the porch, I noticed a black pickup truck parked on the dirt road leading to the property. Through my binoculars, I saw two men taking photos of the property's boundaries. In that moment, I realized I wasn't just dealing with bureaucracy. I was up against something much bigger. The phone rang. It was Sheriff Wilson, calling to warn me about Richard Thompson, the CEO of Golden Heights. Apparently, other historical properties in the area had mysteriously changed hands in recent months. The Collins Mansion, the old Peterson Mill, now all owned by the developer. I realized I was in the middle of a war that had been brewing for a long time. I had to act fast. Using my tech expertise, I installed a state-of-the-art surveillance system at strategic points around the property. Thermal cameras, motion sensors, and high-definition recording. I transformed my grandpa's country house into a digital fortress. Sarah started digging through the county's historical files. The original property documents, dated back to 1982, were different from the digital records. Someone had subtly altered the property boundary markers over the years. The changes were so meticulous that only a keen eye could notice. On a rainy afternoon, the sensors went off. Through the monitor, I saw Brian Mitchell and two men crossing onto the property. They were carrying surveying equipment and a folder full of documents. I immediately called Sheriff Wilson, but kept the cameras rolling. I needed concrete proof. The confrontation was tense. Wilson arrived within minutes, finding the group still on the property. Mitchell tried to explain that he was just doing routine measurements, but the camera footage clearly showed they were repositioning the boundary markers. The look on the architect's face when Wilson mentioned the recordings was pure shock. That very night, I got a call from Robert Parker. His voice was trembling as he said Thompson had shown up at the registry office, demanding access to the original files. Parker refused, citing the need for a court order. The next day, he found his desk completely ransacked. Pieces were starting to fall into place. Golden Heights wasn't just trying to buy up properties. They were systematically manipulating records and redrawing territorial boundaries. The entire valley was under attack by a meticulously planned operation. Sarah discovered that Mitchell had worked on other projects where historical properties, coincidentally, ended up in the hands of big developers. The pattern was always the same: falsified documentation, pressure on public officials, and intimidated property owners. I had the digital evidence, the historical records, and witnesses willing to speak. It was time to confront Thompson and expose the whole scam. But I needed to be careful. A single misstep, and I could lose everything my grandpa had built. The headquarters of Golden Heights Estates was an impressive building in downtown Pine Valley. I set up a meeting with Thompson through his secretary, presenting myself as a potential investor interested in the project. Sarah came along as my legal representative. Thompson welcomed us in his top-floor office. The panoramic view of the valley stretched through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Ironically, I could see my grandpa's house in the distance. He began his rehearsed speech about how Golden Heights would turn the region into an exclusive development hub. I let him talk, watching every gesture, every subtle change in his expression. When he finished, I placed a folder on his desk containing all the evidence we had gathered. High-resolution photos showing Mitchell altering the markers, The original registry documents compared to the tampered versions, witness statements. The smile disappeared from his face as he looked over the contents. He tried to keep his composure, but his hands were trembling slightly. He offered a deal, a generous sum for the property, way above market value. When I refused, his true colors came out. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, Anderson," he shouted. "I have connections that can make your life a living hell. Ask the Collins, ask the Petersons. They learned that the hard way." Sarah stepped in, calmly explaining the legal implications of his actions. Document fraud, trespassing, coercion, federal crimes with heavy penalties. Thompson laughed, mocking our naivety. That's when Sheriff Wilson walked into the room, accompanied by 2 federal agents. Throughout the meeting, every word had been recorded. Thompson's threats were the final piece needed to close the case. The CEO tried to grab his phone, but the agents were quicker. Within minutes, Mitchell was also brought into the room, handcuffed. The look of betrayal on his face as he watched Thompson try to pin everything on him said it all. The files on Golden Heights computers told the whole story. They found documents detailing a scheme that spanned 3 counties. Historical properties were being systematically devalued through record manipulation and pressure on owners. The news spread quickly around town. Other property owners who had been forced to sell started speaking out. Golden Heights' scheme was bigger than we thought. Dozens of families had lost their land due to fraudulent documentation. Robert Parker provided investigators with years' worth of records he had secretly preserved, predicting that one day the truth would need to come out. His courage in keeping copies of the original documents was crucial to dismantling the entire scam. That night, I returned to my grandpa's house with a mix of relief and sadness. Looking out over the valley, I thought of how many other communities might be facing similar situations. Corporate greed threatening to erase decades of family history as easily as signing a check. But I also felt hope. The union of modern tech and traditional values had prevailed. The surveillance cameras and digital records proved to be just as important as people's memories and those old registry documents. The valley was safe, at least for now. The weeks following Thompson's arrest were intense. The FBI set up a special task force to investigate every single transaction of Golden Heights. Every day brought new revelations about the extent of the scam. Property owners from all over the region began coming forward with similar stories of intimidation and suspicious documents. Sarah coordinated a collective action representing the affected families. The Collins were the first to reclaim their historic mansion, followed by the Petersons. The old mill, which for generations ground the local farmers' grain, went back into the right hands. It was like watching a movie in reverse, with each property returning to its original owners. During the investigations, we found out that Mitchell wasn't just the head architect. He was the mastermind behind the forgeries. His background in digital design allowed him to create documents nearly indistinguishable from the originals. In exchange for his cooperation with the authorities, he accepted a plea deal. His confessions opened a real Pandora's box about the developers' practices. The impact on the community was huge. Meetings were held almost daily in the town hall. Property owners shared their stories, lawyers offered legal advice, and gradually, a sense of justice began to be restored. Sheriff Wilson, with his constant, reassuring presence, helped keep things orderly during those turbulent times. Robert Parker emerged as an unlikely hero. His secret archive, meticulously kept over the years, provided the basis for dozens of restitution lawsuits. The little back room at the registry office, which he used to store copies of the original documents, became known as the Room of Truth. One day, while going through some old papers at home, I found a journal from my grandpa. In it, he described his vision for the valley, a place where traditional farming and historical preservation could coexist in harmony. It was exactly the opposite of what Thompson had planned with his luxury condo project. Inspired by those writings, a group of local property owners banded together to create an agricultural cooperative. The century-old vineyards, which were almost destroyed to make way for high-end houses, would now be preserved and cultivated collectively. The idea was to maintain the valley's rural character while ensuring its economic viability. The recovery process wasn't easy. Some properties had undergone significant changes during the time they were under Golden Heights control. Farming equipment had been vandalized, irrigation systems dismantled, historical landmarks removed, but the community stayed united, organizing restoration work parties and sharing resources. Sarah suggested setting up a formal association to protect the valley's historical heritage. With the right legal backing, it would be much harder for any future speculators to repeat Thompson's scheme. The initiative gained momentum quickly. with dozens of property owners joining in. Autumn arrived, bringing with it the first harvest in the post-Golden Heights era. The vineyards, now under the cooperative's care, produced exceptional grapes. We organized a celebration at my grandpa's property, gathering all the families who had stood up and fought to keep their land. It was more than just a party. It was a symbol of our collective victory over corporate greed. The case's repercussions attracted national attention. Journalists began arriving in Pine Valley, eager to cover the story of the tech entrepreneur who used surveillance cameras to bring down a fraudulent real estate scheme. Headlines highlighted the contrast between modern methods and traditional values, but few understood the true scope of what we had accomplished. Thompson's trial was approaching, and with it came new concerns. His lawyers tried to discredit the digital evidence, claiming it had been manipulated. Sarah worked tirelessly to ensure every piece of proof was presented in an ironclad manner. The high-definition recordings, combined with the records preserved by Robert Parker, made a rock-solid case. During the preliminary hearings, we uncovered connections between Golden Heights and other shady developments in different states. Thompson had built a complex web of shell companies, all following the same pattern of fraudulent acquisition of historical properties. The FBI expanded its investigation, revealing a scheme that stretched along the entire West Coast. The Pine Valley community became a model of resistance. Groups from other towns began reaching out for guidance on how to protect their own lands. Sarah organized workshops on real estate rights, while I shared insights about security systems and digital documentation. Sheriff Wilson launched a community surveillance program that combined traditional patrolling with modern technology. We set up an alert system linking every property in the valley, creating a network of mutual protection. Any suspicious activity was immediately reported and recorded. The agricultural cooperative flourished beyond expectations. The recovered vineyards produced their first premium crop, and profits were reinvested in the community. Old cultivation techniques were preserved, now backed up by sustainable farming methods. The valley found its balance between progress and tradition. On one particularly significant afternoon, we gathered all the property owners to inaugurate the Pine Valley Historical Preservation Center. The space, set up in a renovated old barn, would serve as a permanent archive of documents and a research center on local history. Robert Parker was named its first director, a fitting tribute for his years of quiet dedication. The changes went deeper than just surface-level fixes. The whole experience taught us the importance of constant vigilance and community unity. We established strict protocols for any real estate transaction in the valley, with multiple layers of verification and approval. No single entity would ever again have the power to threaten our shared heritage. The impact of the case even extended to state legislation. Sarah worked with lawmakers to create new protections for historical and agricultural properties. The Pine Valley Guidelines, as they came to be known, set much stricter standards for developers and construction companies. Every sunset, as I looked out over the valley from my grandpa's porch, I reflected on how our struggle had gone far beyond a mere property dispute. We'd created a model of modern resistance against corporate greed, proving that technology and tradition can work side by side to preserve our history and our values. The start of spring brought a decisive moment: Thompson's trial. The federal courtroom was packed with Pine Valley residents and journalists. For 5 days we watched as the evidence we'd collected was methodically presented. The high-definition security camera recordings were especially impactful, clearly showing Mitchell and his crew tampering with the property markers. Robert Parker gave a crucial testimony, detailing years of attempted bribes and veiled threats. His normally soft voice echoed firmly in the room as he described how he had secretly preserved the original documents, foreseeing that they'd be needed one day. The jurors listened intently, taking notes as he spoke. Sarah conducted the presentation of the legal evidence with surgical precision. The falsified records, when compared to the originals, revealed a systematic pattern of fraud. Thompson, sitting with his lawyers, maintained a deadpan expression, though his fidgety hands betrayed him. Mitchell, now a prosecution witness, revealed surprising details about the operation. He described secret meetings where Thompson meticulously planned each fraudulent acquisition. The valley was just a part of a bigger plan, a network of luxury developments that would stretch across the wine country. During my testimony, I shared not just the technical evidence, but also the personal story behind the property. I showed old photos of my grandpa building the house, original documents from 1982, and explained how modern technology had become our ally in preserving this legacy. Sheriff Wilson testified about the pattern of intimidation he had observed over the years. His account connected several seemingly isolated incidents, exposing a coordinated strategy to pressure local property owners. Thompson's defense tried to discredit the digital evidence by hiring experts to question the authenticity of the recordings. However, the meticulous documentation of our entire security system, including calibration logs and independent verification records, proved indisputable. The most tense moment of the trial came when Thompson finally took the witness stand. His arrogant demeanor began to crumble under the precise questioning of the prosecution. When confronted with compromising emails found on his own servers, his facade of a respectable businessman completely fell apart. The Collins and the Petersons testified about how they had lost their properties, describing everything from subtle threats to outright vandalism. Their emotional accounts sparked murmurs of outrage in the courtroom. In his closing arguments, the federal prosecutor presented a detailed timeline of the scam, demonstrating how each piece fit into a larger plan of territorial appropriation. The defense tried to paint Thompson as a misunderstood visionary, but the weight of the evidence was overwhelming. The jury took only 6 hours to reach a verdict. When the jury foreperson stood up, the courtroom fell utterly silent. Thompson was found guilty of all charges: fraud, document forgery, intimidation, and conspiracy. The sentencing was to be handed down in the coming weeks, but it was clear justice had been served. Thompson's sentence was exemplary: 20 years in federal prison and fines exceeding tens of millions of dollars. The judge emphasized the premeditated nature of the crimes and their devastating impact on the community. A large portion of the fine money would go to a restoration fund for the affected properties. Mitchell received a reduced sentence due to his cooperation, but he still faced 5 years behind bars. Other Golden Heights executives were indicted as new evidence emerged. The company was completely dissolved, its assets frozen, and later liquidated to compensate the victims. The process of restoring the valley started immediately. The agricultural cooperative took temporary control of the reclaimed lands, ensuring that the vineyards wouldn't be abandoned during the transition. Families who had been forced to move began returning, rebuilding their lives and properties. Sarah coordinated the creation of a trust fund to permanently protect the valley's agricultural land. Property owners could voluntarily include their land in the trust, ensuring it would remain dedicated to farming for generations. The initiative received unanimous support from the community. My grandpa's house became a symbol of a victorious resistance. Rural property groups from all over the country began visiting us, eager to learn how we had combined modern technology with traditional preservation methods. Every visit reinforced the importance of what we had achieved. Robert Parker was honored with a plaque at the new Historical Preservation Center, recognizing his years of quiet bravery. His example led to the creation of strict document protection protocols that were later adopted by registries across the state. Sheriff Wilson implemented a training program for other police departments, teaching them how to identify and combat similar real estate fraud schemes. His experience in Pine Valley became a case study for law enforcement agencies nationwide. On a quiet afternoon, sitting on the porch with a glass of the first wine produced by the cooperative, I realized we had done more than just save some properties. We had preserved a way of life and created a model for other communities to follow. Subscribe to the channel and hit like to get access to more stories like this. A year after the trial, Pine Valley was unrecognizable, not because of the destruction Thompson had planned, but because of the revitalization we achieved. The century-old vineyards, now protected by law, produced grapes of exceptional quality. The agricultural cooperative had become a model of sustainable management, attracting scholars and farmers from different regions. The Historical Preservation Association, originally created to defend our properties, expanded its activities. We developed an educational program that took local students to learn about the valley's history, traditional viticulture, and the importance of environmental conservation. Sarah turned her experience into a legal manual on protecting historical properties, which became a reference for lawyers across the country. Her dedication to the case inspired a new generation of legal professionals to specialize in defending traditional communities. The security system I installed evolved into an integrated network of community protection. We shared our experience with other regions facing similar threats, always emphasizing how technology can be an ally in preserving traditional values. On one special morning, we inaugurated the Valley Guardians Memorial, a space dedicated to everyone who fought to preserve our history. My grandpa's name was among those honored, along with Robert Parker, Sheriff Wilson, and many others who resisted the pressure from Golden Heights. But the most significant transformation was in the community's spirit. The fear and distrust gave way to a renewed sense of unity and shared purpose. Property owners who barely knew each other before were now working together, sharing resources and knowledge. Sometimes, when I look out over the valley from the same spot where it all began, on my grandpa's porch, I think about how what seemed like an individual fight transformed into a collective victory. The vineyards stretch to the horizon. The old properties still hold their historical dignity. And there's a feeling in the air that something valuable has been preserved for future generations. It wasn't just a fight over land or property. It was a battle for the soul of a community. And in that respect, our victory was complete. Subscribe to the channel and hit like to get access to more stories like this.